Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove here today with another book review, and today I'm going to be taking a look at one which collects not only one of the most well-known, iconic Batman stories of all time, but really just one of the most iconic comic books of all time, full stop, because I'm going to be taking a look at the Batman The Dark Knight Saga Deluxe Edition, which collects two stories. It collects The Dark Knight Returns, which is really the main draw for me, also collects its, well, let's say less highly regarded, less popular sequel, The Dark Knight Strikes Again. So in this overview today, I'm going to be taking a look through the book to cover both stories, both Returns and Strikes Again, sharing some of my thoughts on both of those, and just showcasing the book a little bit maybe for those who haven't seen it before, or maybe you're not too familiar with these stories. In the case of Dark Knight Returns, I feel like most people probably are familiar with that one, but maybe you're not, and if so, hopefully this might be of some use to you. So without any further ado, let's take a look inside the book and see what these two stories are about in more detail. Okay, so here we are with the Dark Knight Saga Deluxe Edition. So this is an oversized hardcover, collecting, as I mentioned, both the Dark Knight Returns and the Dark Knight Strikes Again. This particular book here, this Deluxe Edition, I think it is out of print now. This came out a few years ago, and at the time there was no Dark Knight 3, which of course there is now. So this was kind of considered to be the whole Dark Knight Saga, hence the title of the book. Whereas now, obviously, it's not technically the whole thing. Although you could well argue that really only the first story, The Dark Knight Returns, the original story, is the one that's really worth reading, and I know that some people certainly feel that way. But we'll talk about that a little bit more as we look through the book and talk about the two stories in here. So this is just the dust jacket, first of all. This cover here, really iconic image of Batman facing off against Superman from the conclusion of the Dark Knight Returns story. Should probably give a spoiler warning here before I discuss anything else really in the book, even though this is, in terms of Dark Knight Returns, a really well-known, highly regarded story, as I've touched upon. And it's kind of one of those that I feel like a lot of people would probably have read at some point, just given how popular it is. I mean, if you were to look up any list really online, if you put in best comics ever or, top comics of all time, anything along those lines, chances are Dark Knight Returns are going to show up somewhere on that list. It's just that popular, really, that famous. But nevertheless, can't assume everybody's read it, so I do want to give a spoiler warning before I jump into the book, because I will inevitably talk about a lot of plot-related details as I go through here. I like the hardcover design under the dust jacket, though. This really cool image of Batman by Frank Miller. That's really good. The spine here is also pretty colourful and vivid. And then the back, you have an image of Carrie Kelly, who is Robin in here. Yeah, so, like I say, spoiler warning. Just a final fair spoiler warning before I jump into the book and start talking about this, because this is a book that I really like. I mean, it was one of the first comics that I ever read. In fact, I think it might have been the first Batman story I ever did read. Quite a long time ago now, probably 15 or 16 years ago maybe, possibly even a little bit longer than that. But certainly it's been a long time. And then, The Dark Knight Strikes Again, which obviously we've also got in here, was a book that I read much, much later on, because for the longest time I avoided that story just because of the reputation that it has for, well, not being very good. It's got a bit of an infamous reputation, let's say. But first things first, let's talk about The Dark Knight Returns. So the premise of this story, and again, it's one of those where it almost feels a little unnecessary to talk about it, because there's just so many people who've talked about The Dark Knight Returns, whether in videos or articles online, blogs, etc. Everybody's probably had something to say about The Dark Knight Returns at some point, so I don't know if I'm really going to say anything that's particularly new or original. I don't think my take on this is going to blow anybody's mind. Certainly I don't expect it to be the case, but for what it's worth, with its reputation as one of the best Batman stories, I do overall agree with that. I think this really is a great story. So the premise then is that this is set in an alternate continuity from the main DC timeline. This is set in the future with a Bruce Wayne who is in his mid-50s at this point. He's retired from being Batman roughly 10 years before this story starts. In this continuity, when Jason Todd died, the second Robin, Bruce Wayne basically could not deal with that failure, and it led to him giving up his Batman identity and pretty much becoming a recluse. He's not really done much of anything except drink and brood by himself for the last 10 years. But as of the opening of this book, things are getting pretty terrible in Gotham City. And I mean, things are often very terrible in Gotham City, but you basically have this new, incredibly violent gang that's starting to take over and terrorize the streets and the people. They call themselves the Mutants. And as the news reports, which we see a lot of this story is told through the kind of talking heads format of small panels with just journalists and news reporters having conversations about the goings on in Gotham. As Bruce Wayne's watching all this unfold, he decides that he can't take it anymore. He needs to get back into action and do something about it. So hence the return of the Dark Knight. And that's really what the main story is. So we get a really interesting take on Batman in here. I think Frank Miller presented a really interesting version of the character, doing something here that had never really been done before with the character, looking at a Batman who's pretty much past his prime, but still obviously very capable. But in these early scenes here where we see him returning as Batman for the first time, he doesn't immediately kind of get back into it. You know, he makes mistakes, he's out of practice, you know, because he's basically not done anything like this for 10 years. So we get these nice kind of classic Frank Miller bits of inner dialogues, this monologuing from Batman, as he talks about the kind of old instincts coming back to him slowly but surely, and you know, like the muscle memory of his combat moves and everything kind of coming back. But at the same time, as I say, he's a bit rusty, so he's making some mistakes. We see him getting very angry with himself for the mistakes he's making, you know, kind of chastising himself a little bit. But overall, it's really cool stuff. And in terms of what else is going on, we've got Commissioner Gordon, who is on the brink of retirement by this point. We get this young girl here, Carrie Kelly, who is inspired by the return of Batman. She decides she's going to take it upon herself to become a Robin. Initially, she's got nothing to do with Batman, but quickly their paths cross, and he's impressed enough with her that he actually does take her on to be his partner officially. But yeah, so it's a really good story. I think that kind of goes without saying that it's obviously a very influential story. You know, it's just got its place in comics history. But there's just so many cool moments in here. I mean, the artwork, let's talk a little bit about the artwork. So it's penciled by Frank Miller himself. The artwork is, the inking of the artwork is by Klaus Janson, who of course collaborated with Frank Miller on Daredevil as well prior to this in previous years. And the colours are by Lynn Varley. Overall, I think the artwork is really cool, but it's not really some of my favourite ever artwork, with the exception of a few particular panels and pages, which I think are just truly iconic. For example, there's one towards the end with Batman on a horse that's really, really cool. But it is definitely very good, and it's a very distinctive style of artwork. What I like that Frank Miller does in this book is he uses a really cool combination of kind of splash pages like this, with a really awesome, menacing-looking Batman who is just relishing in his ability to just take on these people and to get back into the fight. And also, you get a lot more kind of almost claustrophobic styles of artwork, with lots of pages with just small panels like this, with the talking heads again like that, where there can be quite a few pages at a time where you're just reading very small panels, as it's very dialogue driven. But then when some action starts to appear, usually, you know, when it's Batman himself who's featuring, that's when Miller really lets it open up and he broadens the scale of the artwork. And I think it's a really cool effect to kind of let the story breathe a little bit when you get to those bigger action set pieces. Overall, I think it's very good, and it's something that I reread not too long ago, having not read it for a few years prior to that, to be honest, but it does hold up, in my opinion. I think it's not quite the best comic ever. I don't think it necessarily is perfect. You know, some people give this so much praise as the best comic of all time. Usually it's between this and Watchmen that people tend to debate for that honour. But I don't know if this is really, you know, absolutely 10 out of 10 stuff, but there's no doubt as to why it was so significant when it came out, why it was so influential in, you know, in that period of the mid to late 80s when comics in general were starting to become more mature. This was really one of the stories that kick-started that and really spearheaded that kind of creative movement of comics in that direction. And it is definitely a good story. It's one that I've got to recommend to anybody who's interested in Batman stories. If you haven't read this, if you're one of the few people, I feel like it's got to be a minority of comics fans who haven't read this at some point, but if you haven't, I really do recommend checking this out. You know, there's some really cool stuff happening here with the Joker. Basically, he had been catatonic for years. As soon as he finds out that Batman is back, he suddenly kind of reawakens, and his purpose for being is restored, because it's that classic kind of warped relationship between Batman and the Joker. That's explored quite well in here. Superman, of course, features as well. At this point, Superman is an agent for the government. The government doesn't like what Bruce is doing as Batman. They don't like his activities, so they kind of end up setting Superman on him to try and put a stop to him, which is why they end up facing off in the end and having a big climactic fight, which is probably one of the cooler Batman versus Superman fights that there's ever been over the years. You know, certainly it was the main inspiration for the Batman versus Superman movie a few years ago. Not that that was a great movie, in my opinion, but I thought the fight was kind of cool, and the inspiration that it took from this comic was good to see. Here's that image of Batman on the horse that I mentioned. Really great stuff, love that. This is during a blackout in Gotham. Batman kind of rounds up these young group of kids who he's kind of inspired to fight his cause. Yeah, but then of course it all culminates in the big fight where Batman gets his armor on and just has this no-hold-barred fight with Superman towards the end. Yeah, really good story, and I think overall it was clearly written to be a standalone story, you know, more so than something that was ever really originally intended to have sequels. I don't think back in 1986 when Miller was first working on this and it was published, I don't believe that Miller at that point in time had a definite desire to write sequels and continue this story, because it very much reads as a one and done kind of book, The Dark Knight Returns, and I really think, to be honest, it could have been left at that point. But it did not end there, of course. Years later, Frank Miller would return to the book, or at least to the story, I should say, and carry it on with The Dark Knight Strikes Again, which we're now going to move into and take a look at here. So we move on to The Dark Knight Strikes Again then. So here we are, the sequel to The Dark Knight Returns. Many would say the unnecessary sequel. You know, certainly this is, I've got to say right up front, not as good as The Dark Knight Returns. I think it's got a bit of a notorious reputation, this book. So even if you haven't read this yourself, maybe you're like me and you were put off from reading this book because of, frankly, just how bad you've heard it is over the years. I mean, I read The Dark Knight Returns for the first time, like I say, many years ago now, 15, 16 years ago, I think. Only read this for the first time a couple of years ago because of how bad I'd always heard it was. I mean, as we look through, what you're going to see plenty of examples of, I'm sure, is the artwork here looking really drastically different from how it did in Dark Knight Returns. It's still Frank Miller doing the penciling here. Klaus Janson is not involved inking or in any aspect of the artwork anymore. Perhaps that plays a role in it. But really, it just looks so much more simplistic and basic, really, the artwork here, than it did in that original story. To the point where it's distracting in a way sometimes. I mean, that's the sort of thing I've heard people say about it as well, you know. So that's one of the major criticisms, is just how the artwork just looks kind of bad. I mean, it does look kind of cartoonishly weird at times. I mean, I don't totally hate it, but it does definitely look bizarre. And it's a far cry from what it looked like in The Dark Knight Returns, which I think was vastly superior in terms of the artwork and the story. The story here is basically that Lex Luthor has become president of the United States and is running a dictatorial evil regime, as you'd expect if Luthor was in charge. So Batman is trying to kind of lead a resistance movement, trying to recruit other superheroes in here. At the same time, it's a bit difficult because Superman and Wonder Woman are being forced to work in defense of Luthor's regime. He's kind of keeping people prisoner and threatening them if they don't do what he says. So, you know, there's a bit of a trouble there with those characters, which results in another fight here, which you see between Batman and Superman. This one is not as good as the first fight with as seen in the Dark Knight Returns. It's just not, overall, it's just not as good. I mean, that's as simple as I can put it. But I will say, and this is probably because my expectations were so low with this story, that I didn't totally hate this book when I read it, you know? I mean, I could not have had lower expectations if I'd tried, so there was really no way that this book could disappoint me by the time I finally got around to reading it. So kind of pleasant surprise, as a kind of pleasant surprise, I was kind of entertained, you know? I would not say that it's one of my favourite books. I wouldn't say it's as good as Dark Knight Returns, and it's certainly not as good as many other things, but it was kind of fun. You know, I had a decent time reading this, you know, for all of its weird wackiness, some of the over-the-top nonsense that appears in parts of this story. It was kind of fun for those reasons, in a way, you know? I do think that the story, at the end of the day, doesn't really validate its own existence. I would still say that The Dark Knight Returns is the only necessary reading when it comes to Frank Miller's Dark Knight stories, because, you know, this is not even the end of it anymore. There's a Dark Knight 3, and even another story I think set after Dark Knight 3 now, which I've forgotten the name of, but yeah, so you don't really need to read any of that. You could just read Dark Knight Returns and stop there, and I would think that many people would probably say that's what you should do. But if you want to read on, maybe don't be put off by the reputation of this book. I mean, I would just say manage your expectations. Expect it to be a very strange story. And then you might be entertained, because that's kind of what I experienced when I finally read it. So, you know what? I'm happy to have this book that collects both these stories. But if you're only interested in getting Dark Knight Returns, then that is always available pretty much in trade paperback. Sometimes there's like box sets that collect it as well with other books, other key Batman books from over the years. So you can pretty much always get it. You don't need to track down a copy of this specific deluxe edition if it's hard to find at the moment, if you just want to read the story. But if you do manage to find a copy of this and you do really want to have it, yeah, maybe give both stories a go if you haven't read both of them already. See what you think. And you know what, to those who have read both these stories, would really like to hear the opinions of other people. As I flick through the extras in the back here, just showing off some different pieces of artwork, some sketches, covers of various collections featuring this material over the years. I did at one point have a trade paperback actually of Dark Knight Returns that had that copy, so that's a bit nostalgic for me. But yeah, let me know what you think of the Dark Knight Returns and of the Dark Knight Strikes Again. Really curious to hear what people think. I think especially about Strikes Again, because it's just such a divisive story, such a weird story. It really is. But yeah, you know what? It's all good. It's interesting to read it. Oh, this is a really cool sketch of that Batman on the horse panel that I like so much. Yeah, but that is basically that. It's the Dark Knight Returns. What can I say? It's one of the most influential stories of all time. One of the most popular Batman stories. A must-read story, really. Whether or not you think it is as great as its reputation hails it to be, I do think it's a book that everybody with any interest in Batman should definitely check out at some point if you get a chance. As for Strikes Again, well, read it if you feel like it, and be prepared for quite a surreal experience if you do. But that is the Dark Knight Saga Deluxe Edition, The Dark Knight Returns, and its sequel Strikes Again. I do have a hardcover collection of The Dark Knight 3, The Master Race story. So if you'd be curious in hearing me discuss that book at some point, I am happy to do so. Just let me know in the comments. But otherwise, thank you as always for watching. Appreciate it if you've stuck through the video right to the end here. And I'll be back again soon to discuss something else.